The cold wind carried with it the echoes of battles fought and lost, a mournful song that drifted down the Susquehanna River and swirled around the ancient grounds of Fort Susquehannock. The moon hung high, casting its pale light across the battlefield that had long since grown silent. Yet the silence was deceptive. This was a land where blood had soaked deep into the earth, where the whispers of the past clung to the air like a heavy fog. I stood on the craggy shoreline, my boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The electric lights of Columbia blinked across the water, casting reflections that danced like spirits on the rippling surface. It was a view both familiar and alien. The world I came from was gone, replaced by this fractured reality where history had taken a cruel turn. Wright's Ferry, once a humble river launch and now a burgeoning town that dared to call itself a city, was quiet tonight, its inhabitants blissfully unaware of the war I had come to wage. The year was 1895, but the scars of the Civil War had not faded here, they had deepened. This was not the America I knew. This was a country where the Union had fallen, where the Confederacy's banner flew high, a testament to their twisted vision of dominance. It was a land of cruelty and oppression, a festering wound in the timeline, and it was my task to heal it, no matter the cost. I adjusted the wide-brimmed hat on my head, pulling the shadow further over my face. My duster coat flapped in the wind, concealing the weaponry strapped to my body. A .44 Magnum rested heavy against my hip, a relic that had no place in this era yet would serve me well. Tucked inside my coat was the real weapon, a device capable of altering the flow of time, a beacon of hope in a world drowning in despair. I couldn't shake the weight of the stories that had brought me here, tales of a lone patriot who had once lured the British away from Lancaster, sacrificing himself to save his home. His name had been lost to time, but his legacy burned in the hearts of those who fought for freedom. It was men like him who had inspired the Vandukes, a lineage of warriors scattered across the multiverse, bound by a shared mission to protect their homes, their cities, their people. But this timeline was wrong. Lancaster, my Lancaster, had fallen under the boot of Confederate rule. The city was a ghost of itself, a hollowed-out shell where the people cowered in fear, their voices silenced, their hope extinguished. I couldn't allow this to stand. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the cold, damp earth. It was rich with history, with pain and triumph, with lives lived and lost. I closed my eyes, letting the sensations flow through me, connecting me to the past, the present, and the future. This was my city, my home, and I would fight for it with every ounce of strength I had. The call sign device on my wrist hummed softly, a faint blue light glowing against the darkness. I tapped it, opening a small, swirling portal of light just big enough to slip my hand through. From within, I pulled out a map, not a normal map, but a cartographic representation of timelines and probabilities. The glowing lines shifted and danced, highlighting the fractures in this reality and pointing me toward the key moments that needed to be changed. The first was here, at Fort Susquehannock. In this timeline, it was no longer a historic site but an active Confederate outpost, its stone walls fortified with cannons and patrols. I could see their lanterns in the distance, bobbing like fireflies as the soldiers made their rounds. If I wanted to tip the scales, this would be the place to start. The plan was simple in concept, though the execution would be anything but. I needed to infiltrate the fort, locate their command center, and plant the device that would destabilize their operations. If I succeeded, it would give the remnants of the resistance a fighting chance, a spark to reignite their cause. I took a deep breath and began my approach, slipping into the shadows like a wraith. The night was on my side, its darkness concealing my movements as I crept closer to the walls. My boots made no sound on the soft ground, and my breath was slow and steady, each step measured and deliberate. As I neared the fort, the sounds of the soldiers grew louder: the clink of metal, the murmur of voices, the occasional bark of an officer giving orders. I pressed myself against the outer wall, feeling the cold stone against my back as I scanned the perimeter. The guards were well armed but poorly trained, their movements predictable. It was a small advantage, but I would take what I could get. I waited for the right moment, timing the rotation of the patrols, and then slipped through a gap in their defenses. The inside of the fort was a maze of tents, supply crates, and hastily constructed barricades. I moved with purpose, my hand resting on the hilt of my magnum, ready to draw at a moment's notice. The command tent was easy to spot, larger than the others, its canvas sides glowing faintly from the lanterns within. I approached cautiously, peeking inside to assess the situation. 3 officers sat around a table, their faces stern as they discussed troop movements and supply lines. A map of the region was spread out before them, marked with red and blue lines that told the story of their domination. I slipped a hand inside my coat and pulled out the device. It was small, no larger than a deck of cards, but its power was immense. I set it to the correct frequency, calibrating it to the temporal signatures of this timeline. Once activated, it would create a ripple effect, weakening the Confederate hold on the region and giving the resistance the edge they needed. As I placed the device under the table, a voice rang out behind me. "Halt! Who goes there?" I spun around, my magnum drawn in an instant. A young soldier stood there, his rifle trembling in his hands as he stared at me with wide eyes. He couldn't have been more than 18, a boy forced into a man's war. "Lower your weapon," I said calmly, my voice steady but firm. "You don't want to do this." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the officers in the tent. I could see the fear in his eyes, the doubt. He didn't want to be here any more than I did. Before he could decide, I lunged forward, disarming him with a swift motion and knocking him unconscious with the butt of my gun. I caught him as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. I wasn't here to kill, not unless I had to. The officers inside hadn't noticed the commotion, their voices still raised in heated debate. I slipped away, blending back into the shadows as the device activated, its faint hum lost in the noise of the fort. The night was far from over, but the first blow had been struck. As I made my way back toward the river, I felt the weight of the task ahead. This timeline would not be easy to fix, but I would see it through. For Lancaster. For freedom. For the countless lives that depended on it. My name is Johnny Vanduke, and I am here to fight. The moon had dipped lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the valley. The lights of Columbia twinkled faintly behind me, and Fort Susquehannock was now a smoldering ember in the distance, its once proud Confederate presence disrupted by the small device I had left behind. The hum of the multiverse rippled through my call sign as I trudged along the riverbank, my next objective pulling me like a magnet through the web of probabilities. As I moved, the eerie reality of this timeline gnawed at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just the Confederates who had changed history, it was the multiverse itself. The fractures that allowed me to walk between worlds were unpredictable, and here, they had spilled more than just my presence into this reality. Weapons and technology from far-flung points in time had fallen into this twisted version of the 19th century. Rifles with scopes far beyond their era. Automobiles outfitted with crude armor and mounted machine guns. Even a battered Sherman tank, half buried in the mud near Gettysburg, its turret now cobbled onto a Confederate ironclad patrolling the Chesapeake Bay. The Confederates had no idea what they were dealing with at first. The initial waves of technology had been too advanced, too alien. They couldn't replicate the microchips or complex mechanics of the future. But what they could do, what they had done, was dismantle and reverse engineer the simpler components, blending them with their era's weaponry. Bolt-action rifles now sported hybrid barrels, allowing them to fire experimental ammunition scavenged from other timelines. Artillery pieces had been retrofitted with parts from tanks and cannons, creating devastating war machines far more advanced than anything the Union resistance could muster. Even their steam-powered locomotives had been retrofitted with engines partially derived from diesel technology, giving their supply trains a terrifying speed and efficiency. And then there was the infantry. Confederate soldiers marched into battle wearing armor cobbled together from flak vests and modern Kevlar, wielding rifles equipped with scopes and suppressors ripped from future snipers. The sight of a Civil War soldier sporting night vision goggles or carrying an early model M16 was as grotesque as it was chilling. I reached into my coat and pulled out my own map of this fractured timeline. The glowing lines shifted and pulsed as I studied the ripples emanating from certain points in the multiverse. The next target was a Confederate weapons depot just outside Lancaster, where stolen and retrofitted future tech was being stored and distributed. If I could sabotage their supply chain, it would cripple their ability to maintain their technological edge. I adjusted the call sign device on my wrist, setting it to scan for anomalies. The faint hum deepened as the scanner picked up a concentration of future tech near the depot. I followed the signal, my .44 Magnum heavy on my hip, its matte black surface catching the faint glow of the scanner. As I approached the depot, the scale of the Confederate operation became apparent. Dozens of tents sprawled across the open field, their canvas walls lit from within by electric lanterns, another stolen innovation. Crates labeled with stenciled markings from different eras were stacked high, their contents ranging from disassembled firearms to radio equipment far beyond this timeline's comprehension. I crouched in the tall grass, observing the guards patrolling the perimeter. These weren't the typical infantrymen I had seen at Fort Susquehannock. They were outfitted in a grim amalgamation of Civil War uniforms and tactical gear, their belts bristling with grenades that had no business existing in the 19th century. One soldier carried what looked like a flamethrower, a crude but deadly hybrid of old-world mechanics and future design. The depot itself was a nightmare of anachronisms. A Confederate officer barked orders from a command tent, his voice amplified by a handheld loudspeaker. Nearby, soldiers unloaded crates from an old Huey helicopter, its battered frame painted in Confederate colors. The helicopter couldn't fly, they hadn't figured out how to power it, but its parts were being scavenged for some other infernal purpose. I couldn't afford to engage them directly. The depot was too well defended, and even with my Magnum and call sign, I wasn't equipped for an open battle. I needed to get inside, plant another destabilizer, and vanish before they realized what had happened. Sliding into the shadows, I made my way toward the edge of the depot. The guards were diligent but predictable, their patrol routes leaving small windows of opportunity. I slipped past a pair of sentries, their conversation drifting back to me as I moved. Heard the boys in Richmond got their hands on one of them flying contraptions. A real one this time, not just parts. Yeah? What the hell re they gonna do with it? Ain't no fuel for something like that. They're working on it. Say they found some kinda fusion engine or something. Don't ask me how it works. The thought chilled me. If the Confederacy had access to something as advanced as a fusion engine, this timeline's chances of survival were growing slimmer by the second. I reached the central warehouse, a massive structure built from salvaged steel and wood. Inside, rows of crates and vehicles stretched into the darkness, the air thick with the smell of oil and gunpowder. At the far end of the building, I spotted what I was looking for, a table covered in blueprints, surrounded by Confederate engineers. They were studying something large, its bulk hidden under a canvas tarp. I couldn't make out the details, but the faint glow of its exposed components told me it was some kind of energy weapon. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. I crept closer, my call sign device set to scan for vulnerabilities. The destabilizer in my pocket was ready, its sleek design humming faintly with contained power. If I could plant it near the weapon, the resulting ripple would not only destroy the depot but disrupt the Confederacy's ability to reverse engineer future tech for months, maybe years. The guards were focused on their work, their laughter and conversation masking the faint sound of my boots on the floor. I reached the table and slid the destabilizer under the edge, setting its timer for 5 minutes. As I stepped back, my eyes caught a glimpse of the blueprints scattered across the table. They weren't just building weapons, they were trying to build a portal. A chill ran down my spine. If the Confederacy managed to replicate the multiverse technology that allowed me to travel between timelines, they could spread their influence far beyond this fractured reality. The thought of Confederate forces marching across timelines, armed with weapons from the future, was too horrifying to contemplate. I turned and slipped back into the shadows, my pulse quickening as the destabilizer's timer ticked down. 5 minutes to get out. 5 minutes to disappear. The multiverse was a dangerous place, and this timeline was teetering on the edge of disaster. As I slipped into the woods surrounding the depot, the detonation of the destabilizer thundered behind me, its force shaking the ground and lighting up the night sky like a hellish sunrise. I didn't stop to admire the destruction. I knew better than to linger. The Confederates would be scrambling now, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. My job wasn't to gloat, it was to disappear and keep moving. But something gnawed at the back of my mind, a splinter of doubt I couldn't shake. The sight of those blueprints, the crude attempt at creating a portal, had unsettled me in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the implications of their success that worried me, it was the fact that they'd even known to try. The ability to open a portal wasn't just advanced, it was specific. No timeline I'd ever visited had achieved it on their own, not without some kind of external interference. The technology was inherently tied to the Vandukes. It was ours, and ours alone. No one outside our lineage had ever come close to replicating it. Unless. I stopped in my tracks, the realization hitting me like a cannonball to the chest. My breath caught as the pieces of the puzzle began to align, their sharp edges cutting into the fragile stability of my thoughts. There's no way that was the only portal, I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind in the trees. But that's not the only issue. I crouched down, my back pressed against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak. The cold seeped through my coat as I stared into the distance, my mind racing. The Confederates couldn't have stumbled onto this technology by accident. It wasn't something you reverse engineered, it wasn't something you guessed at. Someone had to have given it to them. Someone who understood its intricacies. Someone like me. The thought twisted my stomach into knots. I'd traveled to countless timelines, seen versions of Earth so strange they bordered on the surreal, but one thing had always been constant: the Vandukes were protectors. We didn't meddle. We didn't betray. We fought to preserve balance, to prevent exactly the kind of chaos I was seeing here. But this timeline, this cursed, broken reality, it had warped everything it touched. And now, it seemed, it had even warped one of us. I clenched my fists, the leather of my gloves creaking as I struggled to steady my breathing. The possibility was too horrific to ignore, a Vanduke native to this timeline, raised in a Confederate-dominated America, corrupted by their ideals and their hunger for power. A rogue Vanduke. Son of a bitch, I muttered, leaning my head back against the tree. They've got one of us. The implications were staggering. A rogue Vanduke wouldn't just be dangerous, they would be catastrophic. The knowledge we carried, the skills we honed, the tools at our disposal, any one of those in the wrong hands could tip the balance of a timeline. But all of them together? It was unthinkable. I stood, pacing the forest floor as my thoughts churned. A Vanduke wouldn't need to scavenge for technology or guess at how to use it. They would know. They would guide the Confederates, showing them how to reverse engineer, how to retrofit, how to weaponize the fragments of the future that had spilled into this timeline. And if they'd opened a portal, it meant they had access to the multiverse. They could call for reinforcements, bring in armies from other timelines, even pull in tech far beyond what had already been scavenged. This wasn't just a timeline in danger. This was the multiverse at stake. I tightened the strap on my call sign device, its faint hum a comforting reminder of the tools at my disposal. If there was a rogue Vanduke in this timeline, they wouldn't be easy to find. But I had an advantage. I was an outsider. They wouldn't know I was here yet. They wouldn't expect me. The first step was to gather more information. The depot was in ruins, but there would be other locations, other Confederate installations where their tech was being stored and studied. If I could find traces of their work, I might be able to track the rogue Vanduke through their influence. The second step, that would be harder. I would need to confront them, to understand why they turned, and, if necessary, to stop them. Permanently. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The Vandukes weren't just allies, they were family. The idea of facing one as an enemy was almost unbearable. But this wasn't about me, or them, or the past we shared. This was about the future, about all futures. I took a deep breath and started moving, my boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The night felt colder now, the weight of my realization settling over me like a heavy cloak. Somewhere out there, a rogue Vanduke was playing puppet master to the Confederacy, twisting the multiverse to their will. But I was here now. And if there was one thing the Vandukes were good at, it was fixing broken timelines. The realization came with a sharp clarity, as though the pieces of a shattered mirror had suddenly fallen into place, reflecting a truth I had somehow known all along. My destination wasn't some remote battlefield or heavily guarded depot. It was right here, in the heart of Lancaster County, the not-so-old, not-so-abandoned loom mill on the south side of Lancaster. The mill had always been an enigma, a relic of an industrial age that seemed to stand outside of time. In every timeline I'd visited, there was always a version of it weathered and looming, a monument to progress and decay. Its location, its structure, even its atmosphere seemed almost deliberate, as though it were placed there not by human hands but by the multiverse itself. I had used the mill before, in my own timeline. It was my sanctuary, my workshop, the place where I honed my skills and built the tools that kept me alive. But in this timeline, it was something far darker. The rogue Vanduke must have claimed it, bending it to their purposes. If they were operating out of the loom mill, it would explain the Confederates' sudden technological leap and the presence of a working portal. I tightened the strap on my call sign device and started toward the mill. The road would be long, but I couldn't risk using the portal to get there. Any significant use of my call sign would be like lighting a beacon for the rogue Vanduke. I needed to move quietly, stay under the radar until I could confirm what I was walking into. The closer I got to Lancaster, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The city itself was a ghost of what it should have been, its streets dimly lit by gas lamps and patrolled by Confederate soldiers. Gone were the bustling markets and lively streets. In their place were whispers, shadows, and the oppressive weight of a people living under occupation. I avoided the main thoroughfares, sticking to the alleys and side streets, my path lit only by the pale glow of the moon. The loom mill rose in the distance, its dark silhouette against the night sky as familiar as it was foreboding. As I approached, the air changed. It wasn't just the cold of the night or the dampness that clung to the riverbanks. It was something deeper, something wrong. The hum of the multiverse was stronger here, a low vibration that resonated in my chest and set my teeth on edge. The mill was alive with activity. Lights glowed in the windows, casting long shadows across the crumbling brick walls. The faint hum of machinery drifted through the air, accompanied by the occasional clank of metal and muffled voices. Whoever was inside was working on something big. I slipped into the shadows, circling the perimeter to get a better view. The Confederate presence was minimal, just a handful of guards stationed near the entrances. That wasn't surprising. The rogue Vanduke wouldn't need an army to protect them, they would rely on the technology and their knowledge of the multiverse to keep intruders out. I crouched behind a pile of rusted scrap, pulling out my scanner. The call sign device hummed softly as it picked up traces of multiversal energy, the readings spiking as I focused on the mill. There it was, a portal, active and stable, deep within the structure. It was smaller than I'd expected, likely a prototype or a backup, but it was enough to cause serious damage if left unchecked. My scanner also picked up something else, something that made my stomach drop. The energy signature of another call sign device. There was no denying it now. The rogue Vanduke was here. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. This was it, the moment I had been building towards since I first stepped into this broken timeline. I would confront them, learn what had driven them to betray everything the Vandukes stood for, and, if necessary, stop them by any means necessary. The loom mill loomed ahead, its dark windows like unblinking eyes watching my every move. I adjusted the grip on my magnum, the weight of the weapon a cold comfort in my hand. "My name is Johnny Vanduke," I whispered to the night, "and I am here to fight." And with that, I stepped into the shadows of the loom mill, ready to face whatever awaited me inside. The loom mill's shadow swallowed me whole as I crept through an opening in the crumbling exterior. The cold, damp air inside carried the faint scent of machine oil and something sharper, metallic blood, maybe, or the residue of experiments gone wrong. The hum of machinery was louder here, echoing off the walls and vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just the sound of gears and pistons, it was multiversal energy, thrumming through the structure like a heartbeat. The mill had changed. In my timeline, it had been a quiet refuge, a place where I could tinker and strategize. Here, it had been transformed into a fortress of innovation and horror. Rusted looms that once wove fabric had been replaced by tables cluttered with tools and disassembled technology. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange devices, a mix of Confederate retrofits and scavenged relics from other timelines. I stayed low, weaving through the shadows as I moved deeper into the building. The guards outside hadn't followed me in, which meant the rogue Vanduke didn't expect an attack. That was good. It gave me time to observe, to plan. The multiversal energy grew stronger with every step, its vibrations almost deafening as I approached the heart of the mill. I rounded a corner and froze. There, in the center of the massive main room, was the portal. It was smaller than the ones I used, a crude and unstable thing made of salvaged parts and retrofitted Confederate tech. Wires and tubes snaked across the floor, connecting the portal to a massive generator that pulsed with an unnatural light. Sparks crackled from the edges of the portal, and the air around it shimmered like a mirage. Standing before it, surrounded by blueprints and strange equipment, was the rogue Vanduke. They were taller than me, their posture rigid and commanding. Their coat was darker, more worn, and their hat cast a deep shadow over their face. I couldn't see their features clearly, but the way they moved, the precision of their gestures as they adjusted the portal's controls, left no doubt they were one of us. I crouched behind a stack of crates, watching as they worked. Their movements were methodical, almost surgical, as they calibrated the portal and made notes on a clipboard. This wasn't the work of someone dabbling in stolen technology. This was a master at work. Impressive, isn't it? The voice cut through the air like a knife, cold and sharp. I froze, realizing too late that they had seen me. The rogue Vanduke didn't look up from the portal as they spoke. "You've been quiet, but not quiet enough. I could feel you the moment you entered the mill. You're like me, after all. We leave ripples wherever we go." I stepped out from behind the crates, my magnum drawn and leveled at their chest. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "We are alike. But I don't betray everything we stand for." The rogue Vanduke turned to face me, their expression obscured by the shadow of their hat. "Betrayal," they echoed, their tone dripping with mockery. You call it betrayal. I call it adaptation. This timeline is different, Johnny. It demands a different kind of Vanduke. I tightened my grip on the magnum. You've aligned yourself with the Confederacy. You've given them technology that could destroy this timeline and others. What the hell are you thinking? They laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. Thinking? I'm doing what needs to be done. The Confederacy is the future here. Resisting them is a waste of time and resources. But guiding them, shaping their growth, that's power. That's control. I took a step closer, the weight of the magnum steadying me. And the countless lives they've destroyed. The futures they've stolen. You're complicit in all of it? The rogue Vanduke's expression hardened. Don't lecture me about morality. You think your crusade makes you righteous? We meddle with timelines, Johnny. We play God every time we step through a portal. Don't pretend you're any different. This isn't about me, I snapped. It's about you and the damage you've done. You've put the multiverse at risk. I can't let you continue. They tilted their head, studying me with an unsettling calm. You're welcome to try, they said, stepping away from the portal. But you'll find I'm not so easy to stop. The tension in the air was palpable as we faced each other, two Vandukes standing on opposite sides of a line that should never have been crossed. My heart pounded, my mind racing as I considered my options. The rogue Vanduke's hand drifted toward their own weapon, a hybrid pistol that glowed faintly with multiversal energy. I didn't wait for them to make the first move. I fired. The crack of the magnum echoed through the mill, the recoil jolting through my arm. The rogue Vanduke moved faster than I thought possible, dodging the shot and returning fire in a single, fluid motion. Their weapon hummed as it discharged, the projectile narrowly missing me and sizzling against the wall behind me. I dove behind a stack of crates, my breath ragged as I calculated my next move. This wasn't just a battle, it was a fight for the soul of the multiverse. And I wasn't leaving without answers or victory. The air in the loom mill crackled with tension, each breath laced with the metallic taste of ozone from the rogue Vanduke's weapon. The crates I crouched behind offered scant protection, their hybrid rounds had torn clean through the wood. Splinters rained down as another shot shattered the stack, forcing me to roll to the side and find new cover. You're quick, I'll give you that, the rogue Vanduke taunted, their voice calm and measured. But we're the same, Johnny. You know how this ends. Their words stoked a fire in me. We're not the same. I yelled, leaning out to fire another shot. The magnum roared, and the bullet struck a piece of machinery, sending a shower of sparks cascading between us. I fight to protect timelines. You're tearing them apart. The rogue Vanduke's silhouette moved like a shadow through the flashing light. Their precision was unnerving, every movement calculated to exploit the terrain. You think you're protecting timelines, they countered, their voice echoing off the walls. "You're just delaying the inevitable. The multiverse is chaos. I've embraced it. You're still clinging to the illusion of order." I ducked low, sprinting toward a conveyor belt while their next shot blasted a chunk of brick from the wall behind me. My mind raced as fast as my feet. I couldn't outgun them. Our training was too similar, our reflexes too evenly matched. I needed to think differently, to exploit the one advantage I had: I wasn't from this timeline. I tapped my call sign device, its blue glow hidden beneath my sleeve. The rogue Vanduke might have felt my presence earlier, but I doubted they could track the device's more subtle functions. I scanned the room, the device highlighting faint traces of temporal energy. A cluster of readings appeared near the portal, and my breath caught. A cache of multiversal tech, likely scavenged and stored for study, sat under a tarp beside the generator. If I could get to it. Another round cracked through the air, and I barely managed to throw myself behind an overturned workbench. The rogue Vanduke's laughter followed, cold and hollow. "What's the matter, Johnny? Out of ideas already?" I gritted my teeth, reloading the Magnum with practiced speed. My mind raced, replaying every fight, every lesson I'd ever learned. The rogue Vanduke wasn't invincible. They were arrogant, overconfident in their belief that this timeline was theirs to control. I could use that. "I'm still here, aren't I?" I called back, firing a shot toward their last position. The round struck a metal pillar, the ricochet sparking as I moved again, drawing their attention away from the portal. Their response was immediate: a burst of hybrid fire that forced me to dive behind a stack of gears. "You're stalling," they said, their voice closer now. "I can feel it." "What's the plan, Johnny?" "Waiting for backup. Hoping the timeline will fix itself." I didn't respond. Instead, I used their approach as cover, inching closer to the portal. The cache of tech was just a few feet away, its tarp shifting slightly in the draft from the generator. My call sign device buzzed faintly as I activated a diagnostic mode, scanning for anything I could use. The readings spiked. Beneath the tarp was a small cylindrical object, glowing faintly with a familiar energy signature. A destabilizer. It wasn't like the ones I carried. This was more advanced, more volatile. If I could activate it, it would disrupt the portal and disable the rogue Vanduke's operations. But it would also level the mill, and I wasn't sure I'd have time to escape. "I know what you're doing," the rogue Vanduke said, their voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You think you can sabotage me? Destroy the portal? Don't bother. I can rebuild it. I can rebuild anything." I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. "Maybe," I said, standing and stepping out from behind the gears. My Magnum hung loosely at my side, the tension in the room tightening like a noose. "But I'll make damn sure you don't have the chance." The rogue Vanduke smirked, their face partially illuminated by the pulsing light of the generator. "Bold words," they said, raising their weapon. "Let's see if you can back them up." Before they could fire, I sprinted toward the cache. Their shot rang out, grazing my shoulder and sending a jolt of pain down my arm. I didn't stop. I reached the tarp, ripping it back to reveal the destabilizer. It was smaller than I'd expected, no bigger than a shoebox, but its design was sleek and deadly. The rogue Vanduke was on me in an instant, their weapon swinging in a wide arc. I ducked, feeling the air shift as the barrel passed inches from my head. I shoved the destabilizer into my coat, pivoting to block their next strike with my forearm. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my already bruised body, but I held my ground. "You don't have to do this," I said, locking eyes with them. For the first time, I saw the faint flicker of hesitation. "You're better than this." The rogue Vanduke's pulse of energy slammed into me like a freight train, sending me hurtling backward. My body collided with a stack of metal crates, the impact rattling through my bones as I crumpled to the ground. Pain shot through my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the world spun around me. "You don't understand what this timeline needs," they growled, their voice echoing with fury, their presence crackling with raw energy. As I struggled to my feet, their words echoed in my mind, twisting and churning with memories long buried but never forgotten. My thoughts drifted through the infinite web of timelines and possibilities, to the countless Vandukes who had come before me, who had fought and sacrificed to protect the multiverse from falling into chaos. I thought of Street Rat Vanduke, who had once stood against the might of an Imperial Star Destroyer orbiting Earth, defying the Empire with nothing but a .44 Magnum and his unyielding resolve. I thought of the orphan Vanduke, who had battled the man behind the slaughter and his army of killer animatronics, his courage forged in the fires of loneliness and survival. I thought of Fallout Boy Vanduke, who had clawed his way through the irradiated wastelands of a timeline where nuclear annihilation was not a threat but a grim reality, his journey marked by sacrifice and a deep longing for redemption. And then there were the others, the ones who pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a Vanduke. The Hunter Vanduke, forever locked in a battle with his counterpart, the Mothman Vanduke, their eternal rivalry a testament to the balance of light and dark in the multiverse. I thought of the original multiversal war, where the first 30 Vandukes had come together to forge the call sign network, their unity creating the foundation that would hold the multiverse together. I remembered the original storyteller, the one who had breathed life into the Vandukes, whose vision had birthed this lineage of protectors, and whose wisdom continued to guide us across the ages. I thought of the war with the Imposter Vanduke and the False Storyteller, their corruption nearly tearing the multiverse apart until the Vandukes, united under one banner, had risen to confront their fallen kin. And I thought of the multiversal war with the vampires, where we had fought against an ancient evil that had threatened to consume every timeline. And how could I forget the day the Vandukes, every single one across the infinite expanse of time and space, had stood together to challenge and defeat the devil himself. That battle had been the pinnacle of what it meant to be a Vanduke: selflessness, unity, and an unshakable belief in the good we could achieve when we stood as one. But my thoughts turned darker, to the Vandukes who had fought and fallen, whose sacrifices could never be undone. I thought of Hell Rider Vanduke, who had burned across timelines on his spectral motorcycle, his flames extinguished in the final moments of his battle against the False Storyteller. I thought of Starfield Vanduke, lost in the void of space, his soul now a beacon among the stars. May their souls rest in peace. I clenched my fists, the memories igniting a fire within me that burned away the pain and fear. These Vandukes, their struggles, their victories, and their sacrifices, they were the reason I fought. They were the reason I could not fail. This timeline, broken as it was, still had hope as long as I stood. The rogue Vanduke stepped closer, their presence a maelstrom of power and defiance. This timeline doesn't need your illusions of heroism, they spat. It needs strength, order, a purpose. I straightened, my chest heaving, the weight of the multiverse on my shoulders but my resolve unshaken. I met their gaze, the raw power of my own conviction radiating through the room. On the contrary, I said, my voice firm, steady, and unyielding. I do know what this timeline needs. I raised my magnum, the familiar weight a promise of what I stood for. It needs the Vandukes. My voice rose, the strength of countless lifetimes and countless battles pouring into my words. And I am here to stay. The rogue Vandukes' eyes narrowed, their energy flaring as they prepared to strike again. But this time, I was ready. This time, I wasn't fighting alone. I carried the strength of every Vanduke, living and gone, in my heart, and I would not let their legacy fall. The rogue Vanduke sneered, their energy crackling like a storm barely contained. You think the legacy of the Vandukes means anything here? In this broken timeline? You cling to ghosts, Johnny. Shadows of a past that can't save you. They raised their weapon, the barrel glowing with multiversal energy. This timeline doesn't need your nostalgia. It needs someone who can do what you're too weak to do, someone who can take control. I gripped my magnum tighter, the weight of it grounding me in the chaos. You're wrong, I said, stepping forward. The distance between us closed, every step charged with purpose. The legacy of the Vandukes isn't about control or power. It's about sacrifice. It's about fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, even when the odds are impossible. Their laughter was cold, empty. Sacrifice. Is that what you call the graves of the ones we've lost? Hell Rider, Starfield, they sacrificed themselves for what? For the multiverse to keep spiraling into chaos. They sacrificed themselves, I said, my voice steady, so the rest of us could keep fighting. So that even timelines like this one could have a chance. and I won't let you dishonor their memory by twisting that into an excuse for tyranny." The rogue Vanduke's smirk faltered for just a moment, a flicker of doubt flashing in their eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. They raised their weapon, the glow intensifying, the energy crackling louder as they prepared to fire. I moved first. The magnum roared in my hand, the shot aimed not at them but at the machinery near their feet. Sparks exploded as the round struck, sending shards of metal flying. They stumbled back, their concentration breaking for a split second. It was all I needed. I charged, closing the distance between us in an instant. Their weapons swung toward me, but I ducked low, my shoulder slamming into their chest with the force of a battering ram. We tumbled to the ground, their weapons skittering across the floor. The fight turned brutal, raw, and visceral. Fists collided with bone, each strike carrying the weight of our convictions. They landed a blow to my ribs that sent pain shooting through my side, but I didn't let it stop me. I countered with a strike to their jaw, the force knocking their hat to the ground. For the first time, I saw their face clearly. It was like looking into a fractured mirror. Their features were mine but harder, sharper, etched with bitterness and anger. Their eyes burned with a hatred that wasn't just for me but for the multiverse itself. "You think you can beat me?" they hissed, their voice laced with venom. "You're nothing but an idealist, clinging to a code that doesn't work." I pinned them to the ground, my magnum pressed against their chest. "And you're a coward," I said, my voice low but filled with fire. "You gave up. You let this timeline break you. But I'm not like you. I'll never stop fighting." They sneered, their hand darting to their call sign device. A pulse of energy surged from it, throwing me backward once more. I hit the ground hard, the air driven from my lungs as I scrambled to my feet. The rogue Vanduke was already standing, their weapon back in their hand, the glow of the portal behind them casting an eerie light across the room. "You can't stop me, Johnny," they said, leveling their weapon at me. "This is my timeline now." I reached into my coat, my fingers closing around the destabilizer I'd taken from the cache. Its hum was faint but steady, a beacon of hope in the chaos. "You're wrong," I said, activating the device. "This timeline doesn't belong to you or me. It belongs to the people we're supposed to protect." Their eyes widened as they realized what I was holding. "No," they growled, taking a step toward me. "You don't know what that will do." "The portal. It's worth the risk," I said, throwing the destabilizer toward the portal. The device arced through the air, its glow intensifying as it neared the swirling energy of the portal. Time seemed to slow as it hit the edge, the destabilizer's hum rising to a deafening pitch before erupting in a blinding burst of light. The portal shuddered, its edges fracturing like shattered glass. The rogue Vanduke screamed, their weapon falling from their hand as they staggered backward. The energy from the destabilizer rippled through the room, tearing apart the machinery and sending shockwaves through the air. I hit the ground, shielding my face as the light consumed everything. The roar of the collapsing portal drowned out all other sounds, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire mill was being pulled into the void. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the portal was gone. The machinery lay in ruins, the glow of multiversal energy replaced by the dim flicker of dying lights. The rogue Vanduke was on their knees, their head bowed, their body trembling. "It's over," I said, rising to my feet. My voice was firm, but my body ached with exhaustion. "You've lost." They looked up at me, their eyes filled not with anger but with despair. "You don't understand," they whispered. "You've doomed this timeline. Without the portal, this timeline can heal," I said, stepping closer. "But only if we let it. Only if we fight for it." They didn't respond, their head dropping as they collapsed to the floor. For a moment, I stood there, my magnum still in hand, my breath heavy in the stillness. The loom mill was quiet now, its chaos reduced to rubble. But the fight wasn't over. The rogue Vanduke had been stopped, but the scars of their actions would linger. I holstered my magnum, turning toward the exit. As I walked away, I whispered a silent promise to the multiverse, to the Vandukes who had come before me and the ones who would follow. I am here to stay. As I turned my back to the rogue Vanduke, the sound of movement behind me froze me in my tracks. The faint click of a hammer being drawn back was unmistakable. I spun around just in time to see them raise a .44 Magnum, their hand trembling but their intent clear. This wasn't over, not for them. But then something happened. The weapon began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until it was almost blinding. The rogue Vanduke's expression twisted from grim determination to wide-eyed terror as the magnum vibrated violently in their grip. "No!" they shouted, their voice cracking with desperation. "No, no, no!" The magnum burst apart in a sudden, deafening explosion of light and energy, the pieces clattering to the ground like shattered glass. The rogue Vanduke staggered back, their hands scorched and shaking, their eyes locked on the broken remnants of the weapon. The glow faded, leaving only silence and the acrid smell of burnt metal. I took a cautious step forward, my own magnum still holstered, my hand resting on it just in case. The rogue Vanduke dropped to their knees, staring at the shattered pieces with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "No," they whispered, their voice trembling. It rejected me." The realization hit me like a cold wind. That magnum hadn't just been a weapon, it had been their call sign. Their link to the multiverse, their identity as a Vanduke, was now severed. The call sign had turned against them, rejecting their corruption, their betrayal. They looked up at me, their face pale, their eyes filled with a desperation I hadn't seen before. "You don't understand," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. I was doing what I thought was right. I was trying to fix this timeline. I stared down at them, the weight of their words sinking in. There was no satisfaction in their defeat, no sense of victory. They had been lost long before this moment, their ideals twisted and their path corrupted. You were never fixing anything, I said, my voice calm but firm. You were breaking it further. And now, you'll never wield the powers of a Vanduke again. They dropped their gaze, their hands trembling as they reached for the broken pieces of the magnum, as if trying to piece it back together. But it was futile. The call sign was gone, its connection severed forever. I stepped back, holstering my own magnum and turning toward the exit once more. The rogue Vanduke might find a way to cobble together a device, might even manage to re-enter the multiverse through sheer determination and ingenuity. But they would never be a Vanduke again. The power, the connection, the purpose, it was lost to them now. As I walked away, the weight of what had happened settled over me. The rogue Vanduke story wasn't over, but it was no longer my concern. They had chosen their path, and the multiverse had rejected them. I exited the loom mill, the cold night air washing over me as I stepped into the shadows. The fight for this timeline wasn't finished, but this chapter was closed. The rogue Vanduke was no longer my enemy. They were a broken piece of a broken timeline, left to face the consequences of their choices. And I had more work to do. The cold night enveloped me as I stepped out of the ruins of the loom mill, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the distance. The air was sharp, biting against my skin, but it carried with it a strange sense of finality. I had done what I could. The rogue Vanduke's fall was inevitable, a consequence of their choices. But the multiverse was vast, and I knew better than to assume this was the end of their story. Still, they were no longer my immediate concern. The streets of Lancaster stretched before me, a patchwork of gas lamps casting faint light onto cobblestone paths. This wasn't my Lancaster. The heart of the city pulsed with the weight of Confederate oppression, its people subdued under the shadow of power that didn't belong here. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that hope still lingered, fragile yet persistent, like embers waiting for a spark. The call sign device on my wrist hummed faintly, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced down, the screen displaying faint traces of multiversal energy dispersing across the timeline. The destabilizer's work was done, the portal destroyed, and the immediate threat neutralized. But there were still anomalies, faint, scattered readings indicating that fragments of future technology remained in Confederate hands. I couldn't leave yet. Not while there was work to be done. The memories of fallen Vandukes weighed heavily on me as I moved through the quiet streets. Hell Rider Vanduke, his flames extinguished in the war against the False Storyteller. Starfield Vanduke, lost among the stars, his presence now only a whisper in the multiverse. Their sacrifices weren't just reminders of what we had lost, they were a call to action. A reminder that the fight never truly ended. I reached the edge of the city, the faint glow of the Susquehanna River visible in the distance. The water moved slowly, its surface shimmering under the pale light of the moon. This river had seen countless battles, its banks soaked with the blood of those who had fought and died for something greater than themselves. It was a fitting place for reflection, a moment to gather my thoughts before the next step. The faint crunch of footsteps on gravel caught my attention, and I turned sharply, my hand instinctively going to the magnum on my hip. A figure emerged from the shadows, their form partially obscured by the dim light. For a moment, my pulse quickened, the thought of the rogue Vanduke returning flashing through my mind. But it wasn't them. It was a man, his clothes ragged, his face gaunt and weary. A local, by the looks of him, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. He hesitated as he saw me, his gaze flicking to the weapon at my side before settling on my face. You're the one they've been talking about," he said, his voice low and cautious. "The one who's been fighting back." I studied him for a moment, lowering my hand but keeping my guard up. "What do you know about me?" I asked. He glanced around nervously, as if expecting Confederate soldiers to appear from the shadows. "Not much," he admitted. "But word's spreading. Someone's taking down their depots, destroying their weapons. People are starting to believe we might have a chance." I looked at him closely, noting the desperation in his eyes. This was what I fought for: people like him, people who had been beaten down but still clung to the faint hope of something better. "You do have a chance," I said, my voice steady. "But it's going to take more than hope. It's going to take action." He nodded, his expression hardening. "We're ready," he said. "There are others. People who want to fight but don't know how. If you can show us, if you can lead us, we'll stand with you." For a moment, I said nothing, the weight of his words settling over me. I had spent so much time fighting alone, carrying the burden of the multiverse on my shoulders, that the idea of leading others felt foreign. But this wasn't just my fight. It never had been. "All right," I said finally, meeting his gaze. "But if we're going to do this, we do it right. No rushing in, no reckless moves. We hit them where it hurts, and we hit them hard." He nodded again, his expression resolute. "What's the plan?" I glanced down at my call sign device, the faint hum of multiversal energy a constant reminder of the tools at my disposal. "First, we gather what we need," I said. "Weapons, supplies, information. Then we take out their remaining tech caches. Without their stolen technology, they'll lose their advantage." The man's eyes lit up with determination, a spark ignited in the darkness. "We'll be ready," he said. "You can count on us." As he disappeared back into the shadows, I turned my gaze back to the river, the faint glow of the city behind me. The rogue Vanduke was no longer my concern, and the Confederates wouldn't hold their grip on this timeline for long. The Vandukes had always been protectors, guardians of the multiverse. And now, in this fractured timeline, I wasn't just here to fight, I was here to lead. The man disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the faint hum of the call sign device. The Susquehanna River stretched before me, its surface a mirror reflecting the moon's pale light. For a moment, the calm was disorienting, a sharp contrast to the chaos I had just left behind. But I knew it wouldn't last. Peace in a timeline like this was a fragile, fleeting thing. I took a deep breath and adjusted the call sign device on my wrist, its soft glow casting eerie shadows on my face. The energy readings from the Confederate tech caches were faint but consistent. They were spread out across the county, hidden in places the Confederates thought were secure. I smirked to myself. No place was truly secure when a Vanduke was involved. The first cache was located on the outskirts of a small town south of Lancaster, one of those places that barely made it onto maps, where the Confederates had set up a minor outpost to move supplies and technology undetected. It would be lightly guarded, which made it the perfect target to hit first. As I walked along the quiet streets, the cold wind tugged at my coat, the silence punctuated by the distant sound of a train whistle. Lancaster in this timeline had a way of making you feel small, the weight of its altered history pressing down like a suffocating fog. But the people here weren't small. They were strong, resilient, even in the face of oppression. And now, with someone to rally behind, they had a chance to rise. The man's words replayed in my mind as I moved, the memory of his weary yet determined expression grounding me. It wasn't just about taking out the Confederate tech caches anymore. This was about giving the people of this timeline the tools to fight back to reclaim what was theirs. By the time I reached the outskirts of the town, the horizon was tinged with the faintest hint of dawn. The Confederate outpost was a ramshackle collection of tents and makeshift buildings, their silhouettes barely visible in the pre-dawn light. A single guard patrolled the perimeter, their rifle slung lazily over their shoulder. Amateurs. I slipped into the shadows, my steps silent on the damp ground. The cold bit at my skin, but I barely felt it, my focus entirely on the task ahead. The cache was likely stored in one of the larger tents near the center of the camp. I needed to disable it quickly and quietly before reinforcements could arrive. The guard passed within a few feet of me, oblivious to my presence as I crouched low behind a stack of crates. I waited for them to move out of sight before darting across the open space, my coat trailing like a shadow behind me. Inside the main tent, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Crates of disassembled technology lined the walls, their labels a jumbled mess of timelines, WWI machine gun parts, World War II radio equipment, even the remnants of an early 2000s drone. The Confederates had clearly been busy, scavenging and retrofitting whatever they could get their hands on. In the center of the tent stood the cache itself, a bulky, makeshift device connected to several generators. Wires snaked across the floor, feeding power into what looked like a hybrid energy storage unit. It was unstable, its core glowing faintly with a pulsing light that suggested it was one wrong move away from going critical. Perfect. I pulled a destabilizer from my coat, its sleek design a stark contrast to the crude contraption before me. As I calibrated the device, the faint hum of the call sign buzzed in my ears, a constant reminder of the multiverse's watchful presence. Let's see how they handle this, I muttered, setting the destabilizer to a 2-minute delay and attaching it to the cache. The device activated with a soft click, its glow syncing with the pulse of the cache. I turned and moved quickly, my steps measured but swift as I exited the tent. The guards still hadn't noticed anything, their lazy patrol taking them farther from the camp. As I disappeared into the trees, the faint whine of the destabilizer reached its peak. A moment later, the explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky, a fiery plume that shattered the stillness. The sound echoed through the valley, a warning shot to the Confederates and a signal to the people of this timeline. The first cache was down, but there were more to go. By midday, I had taken out 2 additional caches, each strike chipping away at the Confederates' technological advantage. With each success, the call sign device buzzed with faint anomalies, the multiverse rippling in response to the shifting balance. The rogue Vanduke had left their mark on this timeline, but now I was erasing it, one cache at a time. As I made my way back toward Lancaster, the streets were no longer silent. Whispers of resistance buzzed through the air, the people emboldened by the destruction of Confederate strongholds. Groups of locals gathered in alleys and shadowed corners, their faces a mixture of fear and determination as they exchanged news and plans. The man I'd met earlier approached me near the edge of town, his expression both cautious and hopeful. "Word's spreading fast," he said. "They're saying someone's taking down the Confederates' tech. People are starting to believe." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. "It's a start," I said. "But there's more to be done. Gather your people. We're going to take the fight to them." His eyes lit up, and he nodded quickly. "We'll be ready." As he disappeared into the crowd, I turned my gaze to the horizon. The Confederate presence in this timeline was strong, but their foundation was crumbling. And now, with the people rallying and their tech caches falling, the tide was beginning to turn. The rogue Vanduke might still be out there, licking their wounds and plotting their return. But for now, I had a mission, a purpose, and a city to save. The air in Lancaster grew electric as whispers of resistance rippled through the city. Every shadowed corner, every quiet alley became a meeting place for those who had endured too much for too long. Their fear was palpable, but so was their determination. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about fighting back. I moved through the city like a ghost, weaving between the gathering clusters of people. The man I'd spoken to earlier had done his part well, spreading the word faster than I could have anticipated. Groups of locals armed with whatever they could find, tools, hunting rifles, even broken farm implements, waited anxiously for direction. I stepped into one of the larger gatherings, a dimly lit room tucked beneath a shuttered shop. The man from before was there, addressing a crowd of nearly 50. Their faces turned toward me as I entered, the room falling silent. "You've done well," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of conviction. "But this is just the beginning." The man stepped aside, gesturing for me to take the floor. I moved to the center of the room, my gaze sweeping across the gathered faces. They were farmers, workers, mothers, fathers, ordinary people pushed to extraordinary measures by extraordinary circumstances. The Confederates have used stolen technology to crush this timeline under their boot, I began, pacing slowly. But we've already proven they're not invincible. Their tech caches are falling, one by one. Their grip on this city is slipping. And now, we're going to break it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, tentative but growing. We need to hit them where it hurts, I continued. Their central command in Lancaster is where they coordinate supply lines, troop movements, and retrofitting efforts. It's their brain. Without it, their entire operation will collapse. The man who had been organizing the group spoke up, his voice steady. "It's heavily guarded. The Confederates aren't fools, they'll expect us to try something." I nodded. "They will. But that's why we don't give them what they expect. We won't hit them head on. We'll disrupt their operations, sow chaos, and take them down piece by piece. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." A woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "What about the people they've taken? My husband was arrested last month. He's in their prison camp on the outskirts." Her words hung heavy in the air. I hadn't forgotten about the prison camps no one in Lancaster had. They were a constant reminder of the Confederates' cruelty, a tool of fear used to keep the population in check. "We'll free them," I said firmly. "But to do that, we need to weaken their defenses first. If we go now, we risk getting everyone killed. The people in those camps need us to be smart, not reckless." The room fell silent again, the gravity of the situation settling over everyone. But the determination in their eyes didn't waver. These were people who had already lost too much. They wouldn't back down now. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation and strikes. The people of Lancaster worked tirelessly, gathering supplies, planning routes, and organizing diversions. I led small groups on raids, targeting key Confederate installations, supply depots, communication hubs, and weapons stockpiles. Each success chipped away at their strength, leaving them scrambling to maintain control. The Confederates began to react, doubling their patrols and fortifying their positions. But their efforts were disorganized, desperate. For every move they made, we were already 3 steps ahead. The call sign device on my wrist buzzed constantly, guiding me to anomalies and providing vital intel. It was as if the multiverse itself was aligning against them. One night, as I returned from a successful raid, I found myself alone on a quiet street, the city's faint glow reflected in the puddles at my feet. My thoughts drifted to the rogue Vanduke. I hadn't seen or heard anything from them since the loom mill. But I knew better than to assume they were gone for good. They were out there, somewhere, nursing their defeat and plotting their next move. The call sign device hummed softly, drawing my attention. I glanced down to see a faint anomaly on the edge of the city, a disturbance too small to be a portal but too significant to ignore. My instincts told me it wasn't Confederate tech. It was something else. Something new. I moved quickly, the streets blurring around me as I followed the signal. The anomaly led me to an abandoned railway station on the outskirts of town. The building was dark, its windows shattered, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. I stepped inside, my magnum drawn, my senses sharp. The signal was stronger here, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I followed it through the empty station, past rows of broken benches and derelict equipment, until I reached the source. It was a small device, no bigger than a shoebox, sitting in the center of the room. Its design was sleek, almost futuristic, and its surface glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. It wasn't Confederate. It wasn't from this timeline at all. I knelt down, my call sign device buzzing as I scanned the object. The readings were strange, erratic, unlike anything I'd encountered before. It wasn't just a piece of tech, it was a message. A warning. And it was from another Vanduke. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The rogue Vanduke might not be my only problem. The multiverse was vast, and its dangers were infinite. This device, whatever it was, carried a purpose I couldn't yet understand. I stared at the device, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. The message it carried wasn't immediately clear, but the energy radiating from it felt undeniable, a fragment of the multiverse itself, left for me to find. I reached out cautiously, the hum of the call sign device growing louder as my hand hovered over the strange object. It wasn't Confederate tech, but something far older, far more deliberate. As my fingers brushed its surface, the glow intensified, and the world around me seemed to blur. A rush of memories, visions, and voices flooded my mind, a cacophony of timelines, battles, and choices. Faces flashed before me, Vandukes I had fought beside, enemies I had vanquished, and horrors I had barely survived. Among them were fragments of the rogue Vanduke's voice, their bitter words echoing in my mind like a curse. You don't understand what this timeline needs. The device suddenly grew cold, its glow fading to a dull flicker. I blinked, pulling my hand back as the vision subsided. My breathing was ragged, my pulse racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a message. It was a warning, a challenge, and perhaps a call to action. I activated my call sign device, its interface scanning the object. The readings were complex, layered with traces of multiversal energy I couldn't fully decipher. But one detail stood out, a faint signature tied to another Vanduke one I didn't recognize. "Who left you here?" I muttered to the device, as though expecting it to answer. The call sign device hummed again, drawing my attention to a new anomaly flickering on its screen. It was faint, just outside the city, but it carried the same energy signature as the object before me. Someone or something was trying to guide me. With no time to waste, I pocketed the glowing device and left the railway station, my magnum drawn as I navigated the quiet streets of Lancaster. The city was still, its oppressive silence broken only by the distant sound of Confederate patrols. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the multiverse pressing down as the anomaly grew closer. The trail led me to a ruined chapel on the outskirts of town, its spire broken, its walls weathered by years of neglect. The air around the building was thick, charged with the same energy that had emanated from the device. It was as if the place had been waiting for me, a crossroads between timelines. I stepped through the splintered door, the faint creak of the hinges echoing through the hollow interior. The chapel was empty, save for a single figure standing at the far end, their back turned to me. They wore a coat like mine, its edges frayed from years of wear. Their hat cast a shadow over their face, but their stance was unmistakable, confident, deliberate, and familiar. "Another Vanduke," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. The figure turned slowly, their face partially obscured by the dim light filtering through the broken stained glass. They looked like me but older, their features hardened by time and loss. "You're late," they said, their voice carrying the weight of countless battles. "I was wondering if you'd find the device." "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand resting on my magnum. They smiled faintly, a flicker of something almost like amusement crossing their face. "Call me Sentinel Vanduke," they said. "I've been watching this timeline for a long time." "Watching?" I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you act?" Sentinel Vanduke's smile faded. "Because this timeline isn't mine to save. It's yours." They gestured to the glowing device in my pocket. "I left that for you, knowing you'd find it. It's a key, a piece of a much larger puzzle." "What puzzle?" I asked, my voice edged with frustration. "This timeline is broken, overrun by the Confederacy, twisted by a rogue Vanduke. What else is there?" "Everything," they said, their tone grim. "The rogue Vanduke is just the beginning. The fractures in this timeline are spreading, and if they're not sealed, they'll bleed into others. This isn't just about Lancaster. It's about the multiverse itself." I tightened my grip on the magnum, my mind racing. "And what's your role in all this?" "I'm here to guide you," Sentinel Vanduke said, their gaze steady. "To help you understand what's at stake. But the fight ahead isn't mine. It's yours. Their words settled heavily over me, the weight of the multiverse once again pressing against my shoulders. If these fractures are spreading, how do I stop them? Sentinel Vanduke reached into their coat, pulling out a small, crystalline object. It shimmered faintly, resonating with the same energy as the device. You seal them, they said simply. But you'll need more than this. The pieces are scattered across this timeline, hidden by the rogue Vanduke and their allies. Find them, and you can repair what's been broken. I took the crystal, its surface cool to the touch. And if I don't, then this timeline will collapse, Sentinel Vanduke said. And it'll take others with it. The gravity of their words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about saving Lancaster or defeating the Confederacy. It was about preserving the fabric of the multiverse itself. I won't let that happen, I said, my voice firm. Sentinel Vanduke nodded, a glimmer of respect in their eyes. Good. Then start with the next anomaly. It's closer than you think. Before I could respond, they stepped back into the shadows, their form dissolving into the faint hum of multiversal energy. I stood alone in the ruined chapel, the weight of their words and the crystal in my hand driving home the enormity of the task ahead. The ruined chapel grew quiet, the lingering hum of Sentinel Vanduke's departure fading into the charged stillness. I stood alone, the crystal in my hand glowing faintly as it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. It was more than just a fragment, it was a key to something far greater, something the rogue Vanduke had tried to bury within the chaos of this timeline. I slipped the crystal into my coat pocket, its energy radiating faintly against my chest. Sentinel Vanduke had said the next anomaly was close, but the faint signals flickering on my call sign device suggested it was more than just near, it was active. A new fracture was forming, and whatever lay ahead wouldn't wait for me to catch my breath. Stepping out of the chapel, the cold night air greeted me, biting against my skin and carrying with it the faint sounds of Lancaster stirring. The people I'd rallied were out there, preparing for the next phase of resistance. They trusted me to lead them, to give them the strength to fight back. But what loomed ahead was something far beyond their reach. The call sign device buzzed softly, its interface displaying a new anomaly forming near the city center, a convergence point. The Confederates, still reeling from the destruction of their tech caches, had unknowingly established a stronghold atop one of the largest fractures in the timeline. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a trap. The rogue Vanduke had likely left it there as a fail-safe, a final gambit to ensure this timeline would spiral into collapse. I moved quickly, weaving through the darkened streets toward the source of the anomaly. The faint glow of Confederate lights in the distance marked their central command post, a fortified structure surrounded by patrols. The tension in the air grew thicker with every step, the hum of the multiverse louder in my ears. The command post was an imposing structure, its walls reinforced with retrofitted technology that glinted under the pale moonlight. Confederate soldiers moved in disciplined patterns, their weapons gleaming with stolen future tech. But it wasn't the guards or the walls that caught my attention, it was the pulsing energy emanating from beneath the building. The fracture was alive, its energy seeping through the ground like cracks in a dam ready to burst. My call sign device struggled to process the readings, the interface flickering erratically as it tried to make sense of the overwhelming signals. Whatever was beneath that building wasn't just a fracture, it was a focal point, a nexus where the multiverse threads were unraveling. I crouched behind a stack of crates, studying the patrol patterns and searching for an entry point. The Confederates had fortified the structure well, but their over-reliance on stolen tech left them vulnerable. Their defenses were focused outward, anticipating a direct assault from the resistance. They weren't prepared for someone like me. I activated the stealth mode on my call sign device, its faint hum masking my presence as I slipped through the shadows. The guards were methodical but predictable, their movements creating just enough gaps for me to weave through. I reached the base of the structure, my hand brushing against the cold metal as I searched for an access point. A vent near the ground offered a narrow path inside. I pried it open, the grating sound masked by the distant chatter of the guards. The narrow tunnel was dark and confining, but it led me directly beneath the command post, where the anomaly's energy was strongest. The room beneath the command post was a stark contrast to the crude fortifications above. The air was thick with multiversal energy, its glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood a device unlike anything I'd seen before, a hybrid of Confederate tech and something far older, far more advanced. It pulsed with an unnatural light, its energy feeding directly into the fracture beneath it. The rogue Vandukes' handiwork was unmistakable. This device wasn't just amplifying the fracture, it was stabilizing it, turning it into a permanent wound in the fabric of the multiverse. If it wasn't destroyed, this timeline would collapse, dragging countless others down with it. I approached cautiously, the call sign device buzzing with warning signals as I examined the machine. Its design was intricate, almost beautiful in its complexity, but it carried the same fatal flaw as all of the rogue Vandukes' creations. It relied on stolen technology, cobbled together from timelines it didn't belong to. The crystal in my pocket hummed softly, resonating with the device as if recognizing its purpose. I pulled it out, the glow intensifying as I brought it closer to the machine. It wasn't just a key, it was the countermeasure, the one thing capable of sealing the fracture and dismantling the rogue Vandukes' trap. But activating it wouldn't be quiet. I placed the crystal into the device, its surface fitting perfectly into an exposed slot. The machine whirred to life, its pulsing light growing erratic as the crystal began to destabilize its core. Alarms blared above me, the sound of boots pounding against the floor signaling that the Confederates had noticed the disturbance. The call sign device buzzed urgently, alerting me to an incoming presence. I turned just as the floor above me exploded inward, debris raining down as a figure dropped into the room. It was the rogue Vanduke. Their coat was singed, their hat gone, and their face bore the marks of recent battles. But their eyes burned with the same defiance, the same twisted determination that had driven them to betray everything the Vandukes stood for. "You just don't know when to quit," they snarled, their weapon already drawn. "This timeline doesn't need saving. It needs me." I drew my magnum, the weight of it steady in my hand. "No," I said, my voice firm. "This timeline needs to heal. And it needs you to let it go." The rogue Vanduke laughed bitterly, their weapon glowing with multiversal energy. "Heal? It's broken beyond repair. You're just delaying the inevitable." I steadied my aim, the crystal's glow intensifying as the machine began to collapse. "Then let me be the one to prove you wrong." The fracture surged, its energy erupting into the room as the rogue Vanduke charged. The final battle had begun, and the fate of the timeline and the multiverse hung in the balance. As the rogue Vanduke charged, I sidestepped, his hybrid weapon slicing through the air where I had stood moments before. The room vibrated with the energy of the collapsing fracture, the unstable device in the center radiating waves of chaotic light. Each swing, each blast from his weapon was relentless, calculated, but there was something else, something wrong. I studied him closely, my magnum ready but my mind racing. His movements were sharper, more precise than before. He was wielding power that shouldn't have been his anymore. His call sign had rejected him during our last battle, severing his connection to the multiverse and stripping him of his abilities. Yet here he was, attacking me with the kind of force only a Vanduke could muster. "How the hell are you doing this?" I muttered under my breath, ducking under another swing and firing a shot that grazed his arm. He barely flinched, his focus unwavering as he pressed forward. Then it hit me. The fractures in this timeline, the strange energy emanating from the device, the impossibility of his restored power, it all connected in a single, horrifying realization. I stopped mid-step, shouting over the din of our battle. "The false storyteller? The imposter? They helped you get your powers back." The rogue Vanduke hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. His expression twisted with anger and guilt, and I knew I had struck the truth. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice laced with fury and desperation. "You damn fool!" I roared, the weight of my realization fueling my words. "We need to stop fighting. You have no clue what will happen with those powers if you keep using them. They're tainted, corrupted. You're tearing this timeline apart." He didn't listen. His eyes burned with the same defiance that had driven him to betray everything we stood for. "They gave me what I needed," he shouted, his voice almost drowned out by the roar of the collapsing machine. "You call it corruption, but I call it salvation. This timeline needed me, and I did what I had to do." I dodged another attack, the heat of his weapon scorching the air around me. "You don't understand," I yelled, my voice raw with desperation. The false storyteller and the imposter don't give, they take. They're using you. If you keep using those powers, you'll destroy this timeline and yourself. He swung again, the force of his strike cracking the floor beneath us. I don't care, he shouted. This timeline is already broken. If I have to destroy it to make it right, then so be it. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. His resolve was absolute, his vision twisted by the very forces he thought he controlled. There was no reasoning with him, no pulling him back from the edge. I fired another shot, this one aimed at his weapon. The impact sent it skittering across the floor, its glow dimming as it came to rest near the unstable device. For a moment, he stood unarmed, his chest heaving as he glared at me with a hatred that burned deeper than words. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, his voice quieter but no less venomous. "To see a timeline fall apart and know you can't fix it? To watch everything you fought for crumble? I did what I had to do. You didn't have to turn to them," I shouted back. "We've all seen timelines fall. We've all felt that pain. But you let it break you. You let them break you." His fists clenched, and I saw the faint glow of energy pulsing around him, the false storyteller's mark, the imposter's influence. "I'm not broken," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm the only one willing to do what's necessary." The fracture surged, its energy tearing through the room in a violent wave. The machine in the center of the room was reaching its limit, its structure groaning as it threatened to collapse entirely. Time was running out. "I won't let you destroy this timeline," I said, leveling my magnum at him. "Not for your pride. Not for your guilt. And not for them." He lunged at me, his fists glowing with corrupted energy. The battle wasn't over. And now, more than ever, I knew what I was fighting for, not just this timeline, but the multiverse itself. The battle raged on, the rogue Vandukes' corrupted energy colliding with the chaos of the fracture and the faint hum of the destabilizing device. Each step, each strike, seemed to pull me deeper into the unraveling fabric of this timeline. But then it happened, a ripple, faint at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't just the multiverse stirring, it was something else, something primal. My vision blurred, the edges of reality bending as the ripple washed over me. I froze mid-motion, the rogue Vandukes' furious strike missing me by inches as my surroundings shifted. The room faded into shadows, and in its place, a battlefield unfolded before my eyes. The Susquehanna River stretched out before me, its banks alive with the chaos of war. Cannon fire boomed, the sharp crack of muskets echoing through the valley as smoke and blood mingled in the air. On either side of the river, two armies clashed, their uniforms blurred by the haze of battle. The water itself seemed to churn with the violence, its surface rippling under the weight of the conflict. And then I saw him. Standing at the river's edge, his presence cutting through the chaos like a blade, was a figure unlike any I had seen before. He was tall, his pale skin illuminated by the flickering glow of the battlefield. Long black hair cascaded over his shoulders, a single beaded braid swaying gently as he moved. His eyes, silver and piercing, seemed to hold the weight of centuries, their gaze fixed on the carnage before him. He wore a coat of deep blue, its fabric pristine save for the blood-soaked red rose imprinted on its back. The symbol glowed faintly, as though alive, pulsing with a rhythm that resonated with the very earth beneath him. In his right hand, he gripped a hatchet, its blade gleaming despite the blood and grime around him. Strapped to his back was a musket, its design old but its presence commanding. The armies didn't seem to notice him, their focus entirely on the battle. But he noticed them. He stood there, still and calm, as though waiting for something. His silver eyes scanned the battlefield, unflinching, as cannon fire screamed past him and musket balls tore through the air. I could feel him, not just see him, but feel his presence in my bones, in my blood. He wasn't just a ripple in the multiverse. He was a force, an entity tied to something far deeper than timelines or fractures. And as I watched him, I knew his name without needing to hear it. The Blue Raven. The vision intensified, his gaze turning sharply toward me as though he could see through the barrier of time and space. His silver eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, a surge of energy tore through me. It wasn't the familiar hum of the multiverse or the steady power of the Vandukes. This was something else, raw, ancient, and unrelenting. The battlefield dissolved, the vision fading as the fractured room around me snapped back into focus. The rogue Vanduke was advancing, their corrupted energy swirling like a storm. But I barely noticed them. My heart pounded, my chest heaving as the newfound power coursed through me. It wasn't the multiverse calling me, it was my blood. This power wasn't from the Vandukes. It was older, deeper, tied to something primal that had been dormant within me until now. My hands trembled as I gripped the magnum, its weight suddenly feeling different, heavier, yet more natural than ever before. The rogue Vanduke hesitated, their corrupted energy faltering for the first time as they stared at me. What is this?" they muttered, their voice tinged with uncertainty. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped forward, my movements steady and deliberate. The fracture in the room pulsed violently, the destabilizer humming louder as it fed off the chaos. But I was calm, the energy within me steadying my breath, sharpening my focus. "This isn't your fight anymore," I said finally, my voice low but carrying a weight that silenced even the roaring fracture. "This timeline isn't yours to break or fix." The rogue Vanduke's expression twisted with anger, but their steps faltered. "You think you can stop me? You think you've found some new power that makes you better than me?" "No," I said, raising the magnum, its barrel gleaming with an energy I couldn't explain. "I'm not better than you. I'm just done with you." The room erupted into motion, the fracture surging, the corrupted energy from the rogue Vanduke clashing with the ancient power now flowing through me. This wasn't just a battle for the timeline, it was a battle for something far greater. And for the first time, I felt ready to face it. The rogue Vanduke roared, their corrupted energy swirling violently as they lunged at me, their strikes desperate and erratic. But I didn't flinch. The power coursing through me wasn't just energy, it was clarity. Each movement felt deliberate, each step purposeful, as though guided by something far older and wiser than myself. I dodged their attack, the fractured floor cracking beneath their impact. My magnum hummed in my hand, its weight resonating with the primal force within me. I fired a shot, not at them, but at the ground just ahead, sending a wave of energy rippling toward them. The blast wasn't from the magnum alone, it carried the raw power of the bloodline I now realized I was tied to. The rogue Vanduke stumbled, their corrupted energy flickering like a dying flame. "What is this?" they spat, their voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "What have you done?" "This isn't me," I said, stepping forward, my voice calm yet heavy with resolve. "This is something older. Something stronger. You've been so consumed by your pride and your guilt that you couldn't see it. This timeline isn't broken because of what happened, it's broken because of what you've done." Their eyes widened, the truth in my words cutting deeper than any wound. But they shook their head, their defiance refusing to fade. "No. This power, it's mine. I can fix this. I can fix everything." "You're wrong," I said, my magnum steady in my hand. "The only thing you've done is make it worse." They lunged again, their corrupted energy flaring brighter as they swung their weapon. But this time, I didn't move to dodge. I stood firm, raising my free hand as the energy collided with me. Instead of tearing through me, it was absorbed, the silver-blue glow of the power within me consuming their attack. The rogue Vanduke staggered back, their weapon falling from their grasp. "Impossible," they muttered, their voice barely audible. "That's not Vanduke power. That's something else." "You're right," I said, taking another step forward. "This isn't Vanduke power. This is blood. This is history. This is the legacy of those who fought before us, not just across timelines, but here, in this place." The vision of the Blue Raven still burned in my mind, his presence an anchor as I confronted the rogue Vanduke. I could feel his energy resonating in the fracture, his legacy tied to the very land beneath us. It wasn't just the multiverse at play here, it was something deeper, something rooted in the soul of this timeline. The fracture in the room surged violently, its energy threatening to tear the entire structure apart. The destabilizer hummed louder, its glow intensifying as it fought to contain the chaos. The rogue Vanduke's gaze flickered between me and the fracture, their desperation clear. "You'll destroy us both," they hissed, their voice filled with venom. "You don't understand what you're doing." I understand enough, I said, my voice steady. I understand that you've lost. And I understand that this timeline can't heal until you're gone. I raised the magnum, its barrel glowing with a silver-blue light that pulsed in time with the fracture. The rogue Vandukes' eyes widened, their expression shifting from anger to fear as they took a step back. "Wait," they said, their voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this together. We can." "You've had your chance," I said, cutting them off. "Now it's time to end this." I fired. The shot wasn't just a bullet, it was a surge of raw power, a manifestation of the force within me. It struck the rogue Vanduke square in the chest, their corrupted energy exploding outward in a violent burst. The room shook as the fracture roared, its energy consuming the remnants of their power. The rogue Vanduke fell to their knees, their body trembling as the corruption was torn away from them. Their eyes, once filled with anger and defiance, now held only emptiness. The glow of the fracture dimmed, its chaotic energy stabilizing as the destabilizer completed its work. They looked up at me, their voice weak. "You don't understand what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," I said, holstering my magnum. "And I know this timeline is better off without you." Their body dissolved into the fading energy of the fracture, their presence erased as the multiverse reclaimed them. The room grew quiet, the hum of the destabilizer fading into silence. The fracture was sealed, its chaotic energy now a faint pulse beneath the ground. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the battle settling over me. The power within me still burned, but it was no longer chaotic, it was steady, a reminder of the legacy I now carried. This wasn't just a victory for the Vandukes. This was something more. The vision of the Blue Raven returned briefly, his silver eyes meeting mine as though acknowledging what had been done. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of the fractured room. I turned and walked away, the echoes of the battle fading behind me. The rogue Vanduke was gone, but the fight for this timeline wasn't over. There were still fractures to seal, still battles to fight. But now, I wasn't just fighting for the multiverse, I was fighting for the blood that bound me to this place. My name is Johnny Vanduke, and I am here to stay. The air outside the ruined command post was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped into the stillness of the Lancaster night. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on my shoulders, but it was a different kind of burden now. This wasn't just about the Vandukes or the multiverse. The power that had surged through me wasn't tied to the call sign network, it was older, more primal, and deeply personal. The memory of the Blue Raven lingered in my mind, his silver eyes piercing through the chaos like a beacon. His presence hadn't been an accident. I could feel it now, the connection between him, the fractures in this timeline, and the energy pulsing faintly in my veins. This wasn't just a battle for the multiverse, it was a battle for the very soul of this timeline, one tied to the blood that coursed through my veins. I made my way through the streets, the call sign device on my wrist still humming faintly, but its signals were quiet now, subdued. The fractures were stabilizing, the rogue Vanduke's corrupted influence erased. But I knew this was only the beginning. The false storyteller and the imposter were still out there, lurking in the shadows, their influence spreading like a disease through the multiverse. As I reached the outskirts of the city, the faint glow of campfires caught my eye. The resistance had gathered, their numbers swelling as news of our victories spread. The man who had first approached me was there, standing at the edge of the camp, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "You did it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The command post is gone. The Confederates are scrambling. They don't know what hit them." I nodded, the weight of exhaustion settling in my bones. "It's a start," I said. "But it's not over. Not yet." The man gestured toward the camp, where groups of resistance fighters were huddled together, their voices low but hopeful. "You've given us more than just a start," he said. "You've given us a chance." I scanned the crowd, their faces tired but resolute. These weren't soldiers, they were farmers, workers, families who had been pushed to the brink. But they were ready to fight, ready to take back what had been stolen from them. "We'll need more than hope to finish this," I said, turning back to him. "The Confederates still have resources, and their grip on this timeline isn't gone yet. We need to strike hard and fast before they can regroup." He nodded, his expression serious. "What's the next step?" I pulled the glowing crystal from my pocket, its faint light pulsing in rhythm with the energy still burning in my blood. "There's still something in this timeline, something tied to the fractures. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to find it. And when I do, we'll finish this." He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the crystal before meeting mine. "And what about you? That power, it's not like anything I've ever seen. Are you sure you're okay?" I clenched the crystal in my hand, the energy within it resonating with the strange, ancient force I now carried. "I'm fine," I said, though the truth was more complicated. I didn't fully understand what had happened back in the command post, or why the Blue Raven had appeared to me. But I knew one thing: this power wasn't just mine, it was tied to this place, this timeline, and its history. The man nodded, trusting my words even if he didn't fully understand them. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, we'll stand with you." I gave him a small nod before turning toward the horizon, the faint glow of the Susquehanna River visible in the distance. The fractures were stabilizing, but I could feel something else, an undercurrent of tension, a shadow lingering just beyond my reach. The false storyteller and the imposter wouldn't let this timeline go without a fight. And now that I had tapped into this new power, I knew they'd come for me. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I felt like I understood my place not just as a Vanduke, but as part of something much larger. The blood that connected me to this timeline wasn't a weakness, it was a strength, a legacy that stretched back to the very foundation of this place. The night deepened, the quiet hum of the Susquehanna River in the distance blending with the faint whispers of the wind. Each step I took toward the next anomaly carried with it the weight of this timeline's history. The power coursing through me still burned, steady and unyielding, as though the Blue Raven himself had left a fragment of his will behind. I moved through the dense woods on the outskirts of Lancaster, my eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. The call sign device on my wrist pulsed faintly, the glow of its interface pointing me toward the anomaly. It was stronger now, its energy more concentrated, as though something or someone was waiting for me. The sound of crackling underbrush pulled my attention. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the magnum at my hip. The forest was alive with the usual night sounds, but this was different, deliberate. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness, my breath steady despite the tension building in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firm. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, I thought it might be a Confederate scout, but as the figure stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, I realized they were something else entirely. It was a man, tall and imposing, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the moon. He wore a coat similar to the rogue Vandukes, but it was tattered and frayed, its once pristine fabric now mottled with grime and blood. His face was pale, his features sharp, and his eyes dark and hollow carried a weight that spoke of countless battles and sacrifices. "You're him," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "The one they've been talking about. The one who's been tearing down the Confederate strongholds." I didn't lower my weapon, my instincts keeping me on edge. "And you are?" He stepped closer, the glint of a knife at his belt catching the moonlight. "Name's Silas," he said, his tone even. "Used to run with the Confederates, back when I thought they were fighting for something worth dying for. But now," he shook his head, his expression hardening. "Now I see what they really are. And I see what you're trying to do." I narrowed my eyes, studying him closely. His words carried conviction, but his body language spoke of someone who had been beaten down, broken, and rebuilt too many times. "If you used to run with them, why should I trust you?" Silas smirked, a bitter edge to his expression. "You shouldn't," he said. "But I've seen enough to know the Confederates are scared of you. They're scrambling, desperate to hold on to what little power they've got left. I figured if you're the one causing all this trouble, you might need someone who knows how they think." I hesitated, weighing his words against the danger of trusting a stranger in a timeline as fractured as this one. "And what do you want in return?" "Just one thing," he said, his voice dropping. "The prison camp outside town. They've got my brother there. You help me get him out, and I'll help you finish what you've started." The mention of the prison camp sent a pang through my chest. The resistance had been whispering about it for days, their desperation to free their loved ones growing with every passing hour. I hadn't planned to strike the camp yet, not until the Confederates were weaker, but Silas's offer couldn't be ignored. I lowered the magnum slightly, though I didn't holster it. "The prison camp is heavily guarded," I said. "We'll need more than just the two of us." Silas nodded, his expression grim. "I've got a few people who'll fight with me. Not many, but enough to cause a distraction. If you can get inside and disable their communications, we'll handle the rest." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than nothing. I holstered the magnum, my decision made. "Fine," I said. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," Silas interrupted, his tone steady. "I'm done with betrayals." The next night, under the cover of darkness, Silas and I stood at the edge of the prison camp. The camp was a sprawling complex, its high fences topped with barbed wire and its watchtowers bristling with searchlights. Confederate guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons gleaming with stolen tech. Silas's small band of fighters waited nearby, their faces tense but determined. "We'll hit the south gate," Silas said, his voice low. "Draw as many of them as we can. That should give you enough time to get inside." I nodded, gripping the magnum tightly. The call sign device buzzed softly, its interface displaying faint anomalies within the camp. The fractures weren't just destabilizing the timeline, they were centered here, feeding off the despair and violence that the camp represented. "Let's move," I said. Silas and his fighters broke off toward the south gate, their footsteps silent as they disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, the sound of gunfire and shouts erupted from the other side of the camp. The guards scrambled, their attention drawn to the sudden attack. I moved quickly, scaling the fence and dropping silently to the ground on the other side. The call sign device buzzed urgently, its glow intensifying as I approached the heart of the camp. The fractures were stronger here, their energy pulsing like a heartbeat beneath my feet. As I slipped through the shadows, disabling guards and avoiding searchlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. The power in my blood burned brighter, its presence a constant reminder that this fight wasn't just about the Confederates or the prisoners. It was about the timeline itself. The tension inside the prison camp was palpable, every shadow seeming to carry the weight of unseen eyes. The chaotic echoes of gunfire and shouts from Silas's distraction created just enough noise to mask my movements, but I knew time was running out. The Confederate guards weren't fools, they'd regroup soon, and when they did, the entire camp would lock down. The call sign device on my wrist buzzed faintly, its interface pulsing with signals that guided me deeper into the heart of the camp. The anomalies here weren't just fractures, they were concentrated points of energy, radiating from the central building where the prisoners were held. Whatever was causing it wasn't just feeding off the fractures, it was amplifying them. I slipped past a pair of guards near a storage shed, their attention drawn to the distant sounds of Silas's team engaging the south gate. As I approached the central building, the hum of the fractures grew louder, resonating not just in my ears but in my chest. The energy wasn't chaotic like before, it was deliberate, focused, as though something or someone was directing it. The main doors to the building were locked, but the call sign device pulsed, its energy interfacing with the lock's crude electronics. Within seconds, the lock clicked open, and I slipped inside, the heavy door closing silently behind me. The interior of the building was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Rows of cells lined the walls, each one filled with prisoners who looked up in confusion as I passed. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies frail from weeks or months of confinement. But their eyes burned with a glimmer of hope as they realized someone had come for them. "Stay quiet," I whispered to a man in the nearest cell, his hands gripping the bars. "I'll get you out. Just hold on." The man nodded, his expression tense but grateful. I moved quickly, following the call sign device's signals toward the source of the anomaly. It led me deeper into the building, past rows of cells and through a series of reinforced doors, each one more heavily secured than the last. The fractures pulsed louder with every step, the energy building until it felt like the very air was alive with tension. I reached the final door, its surface scarred and blackened as though it had endured countless attempts to break it open. The call sign device buzzed urgently, its glow syncing with the strange energy emanating from the other side. Whatever lay beyond this door wasn't just causing the fractures, it was the heart of them. The room beyond was unlike anything I had seen before. It was vast, far larger than the exterior of the building should have allowed, as though the fractures themselves had warped the space. The walls were lined with machinery cobbled together from stolen Confederate tech and fragments of future timelines. In the center of the room stood a glowing pillar of energy, its surface rippling with the unmistakable mark of multiversal power. The fractures converged here, their chaotic energy feeding into the pillar like rivers flowing into a single, ominous sea. And standing before it, their back turned to me, was Silas. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. He hadn't just been a deserter or a man desperate to save his brother, he had been playing me, guiding me into the heart of this anomaly for his own purposes. His presence felt wrong now, his silhouette illuminated by the pulsing glow of the pillar. "Silas!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "Step away from that thing." He turned slowly, his expression calm but his eyes burning with an unnatural light. "You were always going to come here, Johnny," he said, his voice steady and unnervingly certain. "This is where it was always meant to end." "What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, my hand tightening around the magnum. "What is this? What are you doing?" He gestured toward the glowing pillar, his movements deliberate. This timeline was never meant to survive, he said. The fractures, the chaos, they're not accidents. They're corrections. This pillar is the key to resetting everything, to rewriting this broken history into something better. I shook my head, the weight of his words sinking in. This isn't a correction, Silas. It's destruction. You've been using the fractures to amplify your power, haven't you? You're no better than the rogue Vanduke. His expression darkened, and the light in his eyes flared. The rogue Vanduke was weak, he said. They clung to the past, to outdated ideals. But me? I've embraced the truth. The false storyteller showed me what this timeline could be, what it should be. And with this pillar, I can make it happen. The mention of the false storyteller sent a chill down my spine. You don't know what you're doing, I said, my voice hardening. The false storyteller doesn't give power, he corrupts it. If you activate that pillar, you won't just rewrite this timeline. You'll destroy it. And the multiverse along with it. Silas's laugh was cold, hollow. You don't understand, Johnny. This timeline is already dead. I'm giving it a chance to start over. No, I said, raising the magnum. The power in my blood surged, steadying my aim. You're playing with forces you can't control. Step away from the pillar. Now. Silas took a step forward, his expression filled with defiance. You can't stop me, Johnny. This is bigger than you, bigger than the Vandukes. This is the future. The fractures surged violently, their energy flooding the room as the pillar glowed brighter. My call sign device buzzed frantically, its interface flashing warnings I barely had time to read. Time was running out. I fired. The magnum roared, its silver blue energy tearing through the air and striking the base of the pillar. The room shook violently, the fractures screaming as the pillar's glow faltered. Silas roared in anger, his body consumed by the chaotic energy as he charged at me. The final battle had begun. And this time, it wasn't just about saving the timeline. It was about saving the multiverse. The room erupted into chaos as the fractures surged violently, their energy tearing through the air like jagged lightning. The glow of the pillar flickered, its stability faltering under the force of my shot. Silas, consumed by the fracture's power, charged at me with a speed and ferocity that defied reason. His eyes burned with unnatural light, his body radiating the same corrupted energy that had once fueled the rogue Vanduke. I barely had time to dodge as his first strike came down, his fist slamming into the floor and leaving a crater where I had been standing moments before. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through the room, rattling the machinery and sending sparks flying. You don't understand. Silas roared, his voice layered with something otherworldly. This timeline is broken. It needs to be rewritten. I raised the magnum, its silver blue glow resonating with the power in my blood. You're not rewriting anything, I shouted, firing another shot. The bullet struck Silas's shoulder, but instead of falling back, he absorbed the energy, his body glowing brighter. "You can't stop me, Johnny," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the fractured space. "This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." He lunged again, his movements erratic but devastatingly powerful. I ducked under his swing, rolling across the floor and firing another shot at the pillar. The fractures screamed in response, their chaotic energy lashing out in all directions. The call sign device on my wrist buzzed frantically, its interface flashing warnings. The fractures were destabilizing further, their energy feeding into the pillar as it began to pulse uncontrollably. If I didn't stop this soon, the entire timeline and possibly others would collapse. Silas turned toward me, his face twisted in anger and desperation. "You don't get it, do you?" he snarled. "This timeline was never meant to exist. The false storyteller showed me the truth. I'm fixing their mistake." "You're not fixing anything," I shouted back, sidestepping another strike. The floor beneath us cracked and splintered, pieces of it falling into the abyss that the fractures had created. "You're destroying everything, this timeline, the people in it, and yourself." He hesitated for a moment, as if my words had reached some part of him that still remembered what he had been fighting for. But then the glow in his eyes flared again, and whatever humanity he had left was swallowed by the fracture's power. "You're too late," he said, his voice cold and final. "The pillar's almost ready. And when it activates, this timeline will be erased. You can't stop it." "Watch me," I growled, the power in my blood surging as I aimed the magnum directly at him. This time, when I fired, the shot wasn't just energy, it was something deeper, something primal. The silver blue light erupted from the barrel, enveloping Silas in a burst of raw power. He screamed, the fractures around him recoiling as his body convulsed. The energy coursing through him faltered, his movements growing sluggish as he dropped to his knees. The glow of the pillar flickered violently, its surface cracking as the fractures began to collapse in on themselves. The call sign device buzzed again, its warnings turning into a single message: stabilize or destroy. I sprinted toward the pillar, my heart pounding as the fractures lashed out, their chaotic energy cutting through the air. The crystal in my pocket burned against my chest, its glow sinking with the power in my blood. This wasn't just about stopping Silas anymore, this was about saving the timeline itself. I reached the base of the pillar, the fractures screaming as I pulled the crystal from my pocket and slammed it into the exposed core. The energy within the crystal surged outward, its silver blue light overpowering the pillar's corrupted glow. The fractures recoiled, their chaotic energy drawn into the crystal as it began to stabilize the room. "No!" Silas screamed, struggling to his feet. "You can't do this. You don't understand what you're destroying." "I understand enough," I said, turning to face him. This timeline deserves to heal, not be rewritten by your arrogance or the false storyteller's lies. The pillar's glow intensified, the fractures collapsing into the crystal as its light filled the room. Silas staggered, the power leaving his body as the fractures retreated. For a moment, his eyes met mine, and I saw the man he had been before all of this, desperate, broken, but human. The crystal pulsed one final time, its energy consuming the last remnants of the fractures. The room fell silent, the chaotic glow replaced by a steady, calming light. The pillar crumbled into dust, its power extinguished. Silas dropped to his knees, his body trembling as the fracture's influence left him. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice hollow. "I saved this timeline," I said, holstering the magnum. "And I saved you from yourself." He looked up at me, his expression filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and something close to gratitude. But before he could respond, the light of the crystal faded, and the room returned to darkness. Outside, the dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the night. The camp was quiet now, the prisoners freed and the Confederates defeated. The fractures were gone, their chaotic energy replaced by a calm that I hadn't felt in what seemed like ages. I stood at the edge of the camp, the crystal now cool and inert in my pocket. The power in my blood still burned, a reminder of the battle I had fought and the legacy I carried. This timeline wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And for now, that was enough. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the horizon. The fight wasn't over, not for the multiverse, and not for me. The false storyteller and the imposter were still out there, their influence spreading like a shadow. But I would be ready. The sunlight breaking over the horizon cast a warm glow across the camp, the golden light starkly contrasting the chaos and violence that had consumed the night. The prisoners, now free, moved hesitantly toward the edge of the camp, their expressions a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. Silas sat among the ruins of the pillar's chamber, his face pale, his body trembling as the corrupted energy continued to dissipate. I watched from a distance, my hand resting on the hilt of the magnum. The fractures were gone, and the timeline's stability was beginning to return, but the scars of what had happened here would linger. This place, these people, they had endured so much, and it was clear that their journey wasn't over. As I approached Silas, he looked up at me, his silver eyes now dulled, the unnatural glow extinguished. He looked older, as though the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. "You should have let me finish it," he muttered, his voice weak but still carrying a hint of defiance. "This timeline, it would have been better." "No," I said firmly, crouching down to meet his gaze. "You were destroying it, not saving it. This timeline doesn't need to be erased, it needs to heal. And that can't happen through force." Silas looked away, his jaw tightening. "What happens now?" "You make a choice," I said. "You can keep running from what you've done, or you can help fix it." The people here need more than a savior, they need someone who understands their pain and can lead them forward. He was silent for a long moment, the weight of my words settling over him. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat or perhaps acceptance. "I'll try," he said quietly. "I owe them that much." I stood, offering him a hand. He hesitated before taking it, and I helped him to his feet. "Good," I said. "Then start by helping the prisoners. They'll need someone to guide them once the Confederates regroup." As the camp began to empty, the prisoners leaving in small groups to avoid detection, I stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. The call sign device on my wrist was quiet now, its once constant hum reduced to a faint pulse. The fractures were gone, the timeline stabilizing at last. But I knew my work here wasn't finished. The memory of the Blue Raven still lingered in my mind, his presence a reminder of the power that had awakened within me. This wasn't just about the Vandukes or the multiverse anymore. It was about something deeper, something tied to this place, this timeline, and the legacy of those who had fought before me. I adjusted the strap on the call sign device, the weight of the Magnum a comforting presence at my side. The rogue Vanduke was gone, and Silas's misguided ambitions had been stopped, but the false storyteller and the imposter were still out there. Their influence had touched this timeline, and it wouldn't be the last. As I turned to leave, Silas approached me one final time. "What about you?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Where will you go?" I glanced back at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of my lips. "Wherever I'm needed," I said. "This timeline is just one of many. But don't think for a second that means it's any less important. You'll make it better, Silas. Don't waste the second chance you've been given." He nodded, his expression serious. "I won't." With that, I stepped into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees as I made my way toward the horizon. The call sign device hummed faintly, its signals guiding me toward the next ripple, the next battle, the next story waiting to unfold. This timeline wasn't perfect, but it had been saved. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, to protect it, I knew it would endure. The multiverse was vast, its threads woven together in a tapestry of infinite possibilities. But no matter how far I traveled, how many battles I fought, one thing would always remain true. I am a Vanduke, and I'm still the boy who dares to dream, who dares to hope.